Yeah,
Awesome.
awesome.
So the first question, it's a bit more of an introductory question, is basically if you can maybe present yourself to the audience a bit, like, name, surname, and what do you do and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm William Hazard. I make multimedia poems and music, kind of. Um, Poems that have music or that generate their own accompaniment. And I write software that facilitates the composition and performance of multimedia poems of that sort.
Awesome. So let's say for okay, let's start at the beginning. So what was like your musical upbringing? Because you mentioned poetry and you mentioned this marriage of, let's say, poetry, music, and let's say the English language, because I know that you're an educator, a lecturer. So how did that begin? Like, were you mostly into music, or did you start by loving words far more, and then that kind of grew into it? Or what was the background behind that?
My training certainly has been more in poetry than in music. Um, I've always loved both words and music. Uh, but as a kid, I definitely demonstrated more of like a predilection for writing words than I did for writing music. Uh, but I loved music. I was really obsessed with the Beatles when I was in elementary school, like weirdly. And and I remember just begging my parents to let me learn the guitar. I really wanted to learn to play the guitar. And uh, and they were not into that idea. I don't know why. They thought that I should learn the piano first. So I took some piano lessons, and I was a really uh, horrible piano student because I didn't want to do it. I have a lot of friends who teach piano now who complain about students exactly like the student that I was um, when I was a kid. I did learn some pretty valuable things, I think, um, from taking piano lessons. I mean, even just like how to look at a piece of sheet music and have like some idea of what's going on. Um, that in itself is a valuable thing. Um, Even though that's still not a space in which I feel like extremely comfortable, at least having some understanding of that is helpful. Um, and yeah, I remember, I think that was probably when I was like 8 or 9 that I started doing that. And around the same time, I remember we had free reading and writing time in school. And I wrote uh, a little story essay thing, just sort of musings about uh, my difficulty in understanding how I could both like my friend and be angry with my friend at the same time. And which is like still what I write about in some ways. Um, my difficulty in understanding things, and particularly in understanding like interpersonal relationships. Um, but my teacher picked it up and uh, and said like, "This is good. Maybe you could be a writer someday." And uh, and no one had ever told me I was good at anything before in my life up to that point. And I had often been told that I was bad at things. I was bad at a great many things as a kid. Um, and I think I wanted to be good at something. I wanted to feel like I had a talent or a predisposition in some area. So I really latched onto that and pursued that hard and dedicated a lot of myself um, to that practice, to just writing as much as I could in different formats. Um, I wrote little comic strips and illustrated them myself and would give them to my friends at lunch. I wrote scripts for comic books because I was very into comic books, and I continued to write a lot of, like short stories, fiction, uh, kind of things. I started to discover poetry in high school, and I also finally did pick up the guitar in high school. Um, and both of those were things that I really loved right off the bat. I think the guitar had like a it felt intuitive in some way that the keyboard as like an interface had never felt to me. The keyboard to me feels very rational, and the guitar is very irrational, I think. Um, I mean, like frets make sense that each fret is a half step. Makes sense as an interface. But like, why are there six of them? Why those six? It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, I
Um,
do agree.
but there is like, or there was for me something really pleasurable in just gaining sort of muscle memory and facility with that interface and being able to play and improvise in particular. So I studied jazz at first and was really drawn to that and to improvisation.
So you
Yeah.
mentioned you mentioned here that you do a lot of fictional stories as well, like short stories and stuff like that. So maybe I can just take you on a detour here. When you're creating, let's say, as you're writing and creating a story, so there's a narrative, there's our characters, I assume, and what I want to know and what kind of interests me is, there's a world within that, right? There's like a world building
Mhm.
aspect to it. And I know when I'm making music, I try to connect to that world building aspect. And I just want to know, do you find that when you're doing music as opposed to writing, do you try to connect these kind of creative mindsets that you create, like, so that's connected, so it's interplaying between each other? Do you do that?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's such a great connection. I feel like I've heard you talk about that in ambient music specifically, the sort of world
Mm,
building or environment building aspect of it. And that is uh, definitely an important piece. And that's something that I'm thinking about a lot for a piece I'm working on right now. That I think I'm always thinking about it. What's the sort of like room that I'm inviting you into here?
mhm,
What's going on in that room? What does it feel like to be there? Um, I think that's the level on which I think about it a little bit, in terms of relating music to text. Like if I'm working on a multimedia piece now and there's a textual element and a musical element. Um, I'm thinking about it, yeah, in terms of like how can these things sort of resonate with each other, um, as opposed to creating literal diegetic sound.
mhm.
So like something I don't really do is like, um, and then so and so called me on the phone. Bring, like that's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
something that I'm interested in. But but maybe, I mean, to use an example from a piece that I am working on like literally today, like this week, um, talking about texting at some point in the
Mhm,
piece and then sampling iOS system sounds, like
mhm,
for
mhm.
percussion or something like that, and having these
So
kind of,
very vapor wavy type of doing it, right?
yeah, or
Like,
having these
mhm,
sort of resonances between things,
mhm,
or
mhm,
having a sort of melancholic sound coincide with like a melancholic mood in the story,
mhm.
um, or in the poem, or whatever the poem story. Um, because
Do you
also the
find
work,
it?
yeah.
Do you find, like, because you mentioned melancholic sound, so I'm kind of guessing, like, because you mentioned like iOS sound and stuff like that, because they're always kind of, high fidelity, cheery, and like very very snappy. So I'm kind of guessing, do you find, like, are you searching for a certain mood within a sound of itself, like? Are you seeing that when you're trying to forge for sounds and stuff like that?
I think so. I think something that I'm definitely interested in is uh, sharing the sound of being alone with someone else,
Okay.
if that makes sense. That
What would be the sound of loneliness? Let's say, for example, or of being alone.
um, so iOS system sounds are lonely to me,
Really?
because
Why?
if I'm texting you, I'm probably not in a room with someone
Hmm.
else or like interacting in real time with someone else.
Yeah,
I'm
but
sort
at the
of like,
same time you're connecting, right?
yeah, that's true, but I'm sort of
Okay.
reaching out across a void. I think also like samples of myself typing on mechanical keyboards or
Hmm.
walking by myself in the woods. Those are all things that I've used. Um, I think being alone is really interesting to me, and being with others is really interesting to me. Um, so if I can take that sort of part of myself that is only apparent to myself when I'm alone and share that with someone else, there's like
Hmm.
an incredible intimacy and connection to be gained in that. Um, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. I think
The
like I'm
the kind
just
of vulnerability of that.
yeah, yeah, because like with me it's like a similar story. I try to like find fragility in sound. Like
Hmm.
what's that makes it sound fragile? So this is maybe like why I enjoy Seat Lombard stuff or something like that, because like okay, yeah, you can have the chaotic nature of whatever. There's like there are tones and there is stuff like there that really connects, in this fragile sense. This is why, let's say, for example, if you probably have heard like Josh Mason's music.
Hmm.
So like for me, this is like perfect for fragile, extremely fragile music. Like it's almost akin to the lowercase music genre or like sub genre, of this
Yeah,
trying
it's
to find.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny that you bring up lowercase because I've been thinking about that with the piece that I've been working on
Mhm.
lately about lowercase and revisiting a lot of Claire Rousse's work in
Mhm.
particular, um, and that collaborative album she did with Patrick Shiraishi, "Now I'm Found,"
Mhm.
um, very much in that sort of lowercase idiom, which maybe dovetails from a technical standpoint with SuperLied.
Mhm. Mhm.
How to get SuperLied to sort of do that sort of thing was an interesting uh, technical challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me just jump you off from this point. Uh, you mentioned like super lead, and we're gonna talk about it obviously, but like, where did the software engineering come into this whole world of balancing words and music?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we skipped over a lot. I talked about like being 18 and
Yeah.
I'm 33 now. So a lot happened in between those things, at least like for me on my
Yeah,
own
just
journey.
you can still try to connect it to that point. Sorry for
Yeah, no,
interrupting.
I feel like I jumped a lot, but yeah, so I was doing the like band thing for a while, like being in guitar bands, and writing rock songs and playing guitar solos and singing and stuff, for a while in high school and in college, um, that were about like 40% about making music and 60% about getting drunk, those kind of bands.
So most
And
bands, yeah.
yeah, and it was like a lot of fun at the time, but I did not really think of it as a serious artistic practice. I thought of poetry as a serious artistic practice for me. I mean, and I had friends who I thought of as sort of like serious musicians or like real musicians, and I sort of didn't see myself that way. I saw music as a space of like play where I could maybe open up some ideas that might factor into what I consider to be the serious or important work of poetry. Um, and I think really in graduate school, I did an MFA at Temple University, which is where I teach now. Um, and while I was there, I got introduced to some like multimedia poetry stuff, like Susan Howe's collaborations with David Grubbs on stuff
Mhm.
like Frolic Architecture or Wood Slipper Countercladder. Um, Carolyn Bergvall's work with Ingar Zak on the Drift project. These pieces that involved words, often with like synthesizer music or computer music. Um, and that was really intriguing to me. I had some exposure to uh, synthesizers. Um, I had gotten to know a guy in Chicago who um, had been a heroin addict, and when he got clean, a part of how he like stayed clean was that he would set aside the money he used to spend on heroin and spend it on synthesizers. So he lived with his mother, but he had this incredible collection of synthesizers, um, and in this room with like blackout curtains, and we used to hang out in there and just play for hours and hours on end, like with like a Moog Voyager and an MS-20 and like a Prophet 8 and all these really cool synths. And I got to learn a little bit from that person about just like the basics of this sort of like sculptural metaphor of subtractive synthesis and
Hmm.
like what an envelope is and things like that. What an LFO is. Um, so I had that kind of exposure um, to synthesizers, and I had a little microKORG. And so in grad school, as I was being exposed to this stuff, I thought like I could maybe do something like that, and maybe it would be interesting to try to like bring this playful music part of my mind into direct conversation with the more quote unquote like serious poetry part of my mind.
Hmm.
Um, and I was thinking about a mentor of mine, a poet named Monica Berlin, who had always given me a hard time and basically told me that I took myself too damn seriously and that I needed to figure out how to play in the work. Um, she had always identified that as a challenge for me, um, and she was really good at that. She was a great model of how to like play seriously, if that makes sense. Um,
Hmm.
and so I was sort of trying to find that and thinking about multimedia poetry and thinking like, okay, how can I approach this and maybe use this as a way to get into that space of play, or of like serious play, quote unquote. And I started doing some performances where I accompanied myself on a little microKORG and like a DR550 drum machine. Um, and they were fun for sure, um, and weird and goofy. They were maybe a little less Susan Howe or Carolyn Bergvall and a little more like Ken Nordine or Joe Frank, um, who I also love their work. And I actually really deeply admire the like silliness of what Ken Nordine does and the lack of like self-seriousness in his work. Um, but it wasn't quite where I wanted to be. Um, it was like a little too goofy and it didn't have the fragility that you were talking about. Um, and also I was running into some technical problems. So as I mentioned earlier, I was not a particularly adept keyboard player. I could, figure it out and get around, but I was not extremely skilled, and I didn't have the kind of muscle memory and facility with that um, that I really needed to be performing in that way.
Have
Um,
you ever thought about, sorry, have you ever thought about like incorporating the guitar into this setup since, you said that guitar made far more sense to you?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
The last couple pieces I've done, I have actually
Hmm.
used an acoustic guitar. Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, the performance for Blue Moon Triptych involves an acoustic guitar. In the context of SuperLied. And the piece I'm working on right now to perform at Flat Imagination with Riley and Dan also involves some like pre-recorded acoustic guitar material,
Awesome.
um, sort of like samples of that. But yeah, at any rate, where I wound up going with yeah, I found it really difficult to play and speak at the same time.
Yeah, I can imagine it's a
Um,
rhythm thing as well, right?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised by that because I had always been able to play and sing. Um, but you're sort of in sync with yourself
Yeah.
in this like often like pretty basic way um, when you're playing and singing. And when you're playing and speaking, there are more of these sort of like um, weird syncopations and polyrhythms that happen that can be kind of hard to keep track of, or it's very easy to get lost. Um, so that was a difficulty. So just like from a technical problem solving perspective, I needed a solution for that. And I had a little exposure to like the idea of patching at least from that uh old friend's MS-20, and I had always thought that was cool. Um, so like early in the pandemic, I took the modular dive a little bit and picked up a
Mhm.
Mother 32, um, and then a DFAM, and those created a nice little like accompaniment instrument. Um, but there was another problem that arose, um, that was maybe symptomatic of my like self-seriousness or obsessiveness, which was I was having difficulty making what I felt were really meaningful choices about how
We're
to,
we're talking in modular, right?
yeah,
Or okay,
um,
okay.
yeah, and about how to relate that to textual ideas.
Hmm.
Thinking like, okay, how does this music relate to this text? Um, and how can I sort of intertwine them in a way that does not feel arbitrary, but that feels kind of deeply meaningful? And around that time, so I'm like messing around with modular. I'm sort of thinking about how do these things relate to each other. Around that time, a theater company here in Philly called New Paradise Laboratories had put all of their material, all the recordings they had of their plays up on Vimeo. I feel like a lot of places were doing things like this early in the pandemic, like sharing a lot of material for free. I think like Moog shared some stuff for free. It was like,
Hmm.
here's stuff to like entertain yourself with in your home so that you'll stay the fuck home. Um, so New Paradise put their stuff up on Vimeo, and I got to see a play that I hadn't seen before, by Whit McLaughlin, with sound design by Bahab Rainey, called Oh Monsters. And Whit is a good friend of mine. Uh, but yeah, I hadn't seen that show. Uh, and I was really bowled over by the sound design of it. And so immediately after watching it, I I called Whit and I said, how the hell did Bob make these sounds? Like I've never heard anything like this. This is nuts. And and he said like, oh, I think he used like something on the computer is like something called SuperCollider, I think. And so that really sent me down a rabbit hole. And working in SuperCollider and just sort of getting familiar with some real basics, um, in a really piecemeal way, or a really sort of like fumbling way. I remember I was finding a lot of like dissertations and academic papers online and just like copying code chunks and trying to figure out how they worked and just reading about them. Um, and so doing that and sort of futzing around with that led pretty quickly to this idea of, oh, I could uh, make something where I put in a text and that generates music. That seems like a thing that this could do. Um,
So it was Super Collider, the door to coding, which you took. So this was like the first gate, because
mhm,
I know you from schicksalslied, which is like this Norn script that basically it's like a poetry script, right? So
mhm.
uh, was this like something that started in SuperLied? You found it, not SuperLied, sorry, SuperCollider, and you found it, okay, so let's just try to translate this into a Norse environment. Like, was this the way how it kind of came to be?
In a roundabout way, yeah. So
Okay.
it started out in Super Collider, but I had no idea how to write like synth defs in
Hmm.
Super Collider or how to like actually make it make the like sounds that I wanted it to make. Um, so I was able to find like a dissertation, so I think it was a dissertation somewhere that actually had an example of this exact idea
Hmm.
of text into music. They were doing it in a different way than I do it now. Um, they were doing it through explicitly mapping, like A equals this number, B equals this number, C equals this number, um, which uh, it was how I did it initially. And then I kind of went a different direction and started using ASCII.
Hmm.
rather than explicitly declaring values for each possible character, just because there are a lot of characters, and I wanted people to be able to write in different languages and use, like Cyrillic characters or things like that, and for it to just still work.
Can you just
Um,
explain ASCII again, maybe for the audience?
yeah, essentially uh, a number that is already assigned to every character that you could possibly type uh, on a keyboard. Um, and your computer knows what these numbers are. So rather than explicitly declaring A is going to be 1, B is going to be 2, C is going to be 3, I was able to just say, get the ASCII values for whatever the characters are. Um, so it was sort of one less thing that the program had to do, um, which became important because as I was playing around in SuperCollider, it was just playing the default SuperCollider synth, which doesn't sound very interesting. And I had also been futzing around in with modular. And so my immediate thought was like, and I would love to be able to use this sequencing idea, but for modular. And that was when I discovered Crow. And Crow seemed like the thing that could do that.
So
Um,
basically, Crow was your entry point into the whole Mono ecosystem. Oh, okay. Wow.
yeah. So that was like a very specific need that I had, and Crow seemed
Hmm.
like uh, the only thing that really had been like purpose
Hmm.
built to fulfill that kind of need. I mean, I guess I could have done it with like MIDI or something,
Hmm.
but Crow seemed like really perfect. And obviously I was sort of immediately attracted to the whole sort of mono ethos and vibe.
Hmm.
Um, so it became trying to rewrite this thing that I had written in SuperCollider, but for Crow. Um, and I was still on this mapping idea, A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, or whatever. Uh,
Hmm.
I think it's something like that. And Crow is very limited in terms of the size of scripts that it can use.
Yeah, okay.
So it couldn't hold that whole map. That just wasn't going to work. Like you could maybe put the map on Crow, but then you couldn't write all the other stuff about how you're going to turn that into music. Or you could write all the stuff about how you're going to turn it into music, but you couldn't have the map. Um, so I sort of hit a wall with this idea and then thought, oh, norns, maybe norns is the thing that can do this.
Because
Um,
like that's like an intermediate. I mean, as I understand it, you create a script on norms, and then that gets translated through Crow into whatever CV magic you want to make, right? Like, was this
yeah,
your thinking in that point?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
Okay.
that was what I was working on for a while was I want to write something for Norns that will send CVs out from Crow so I can sequence my modular with a text document. And at that point um there was not like a live text entry facet to it. It
Hmm.
was just like you put in a static document and it will play
Hmm.
through the whole document. Um, and that was what I was experimenting with for a while. Um, and with a lot of help from Dan, I
Hmm.
was able to get that working and sort of translate those ideas that I had in SuperCollider into a Norn script um, that would talk to Crow.
So is
And
that so
yeah,
Dan was like at that time your mentor, would you say? At least when it comes to Lua scripting and stuff like that.
yeah, I mean, Dan
Hmm.
helped me enormously. And I think in some way, Dan is like all of our mentor.
Yeah, yeah, that's
uh,
true. That's true.
by way of the studies, but also through their engagement with the Lions Forum and that sort of thing. And yeah, I don't remember how I got myself into this situation, but I had a situation where I had a show coming up, and uh, the script was like, and I had resolved to perform the show with the script, and the script was like 80% functional, like maybe a week out from the show, and I was freaking out. um, just
So
thinking like
what
I'm
were the
yeah.
initial bugs or issues regarding the script? Like, I mean, as we know,
Yeah.
schicksalslied today, fully functional.
Mhm.
What were the problems that you basically that kind of kept you at edge before the show?
I think at the time, and this is something that I've encountered kind of repeatedly in software development, is I can kind of write myself from something that works
Mm-hmm.
into the sort of like dark woods of something that doesn't work on my way to something that works again in a new way. Um, I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay,
Um,
sure.
so so I had something that worked. This is how I remember it anyway. I had something that worked that was doing what I needed it to, which was, sending the uh, numeric values from a text to the modular synth by way of crow from norns. But I wanted to do something with my voice um, in the performance. I wanted to be able to sort of like manipulate my voice in interesting ways and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. And I wanted that to be a performative element. So I thought, and I wasn't using soft cut for anything on norns. And I had sort of been through the studies. So I thought like, oh, maybe I could use soft cut for something. And I was trying, I think, to do a combo script of my text to music thing, which I wouldn't even call schicksalslied at that point. It
Mm-hmm.
it had no user interface. It was just sort of that idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, and I was trying to do a sort of mashup of that with MLR for the performance, and that was the thing that I couldn't get to
Ah,
work.
okay. Yeah,
But
yeah.
I had it like half working, and I don't think I had like saved the old version anywhere, so I was just like screwed going into this performance. I had no idea what I was going to do, and um, and Dan really went out of their way to like save my butt and really help me get that combo
Yeah.
script together for the performance. And that experience was very educational, um, in several different ways, like from a technical standpoint, like a scripting perspective, um, but also in terms of just like building relationship and like building trust
Mm-hmm.
in the community, and realizing like how much I could learn, how quickly just by like sticking close to these people, and engaging with this community, with the Lines Forum community.
Yeah, yeah. And as well
Um,
as from the Luck Dragon people, right?
yeah, yeah,
When it comes
um,
to that.
yeah. So I had that kind of Norns thing. It was less like Schicksalslied, I would say, than it was like Crayon Lead, but running on a Norns.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think through working on that, I discovered that I could do the ASCII thing. Like someone online was just like, "Have you thought about just doing it with ASCII?" And I wish I could remember who that was, and realized
Yeah,
like,
it
yeah,
always it always happens when when asking people on the Lines forum to just like somebody will give you like the most obvious answer, and it just like and you just like hit your head just going, why didn't I think of that? Like because it's like it's right there,
yeah,
right? It's yeah.
yeah, and that, yeah, that was like an exploding brain moment for sure, and that led to me going back to Crow and thinking, oh, if I can do it with ASCII, then now the size limitation on Crow is no longer a problem. And so I was able to do a standalone Crow thing. And that became the first script that I released on
Hmm.
Lines, Crayon Lead. Um, and Flash Crash created a nice kind of like deadline for like quote unquote like finishing at least like a release version of that. Um, Yeah, but at that point I was screwing around on Norns already because I had been, and I
Hmm.
had come to quite enjoy Norns as a development environment and as a performance tool. Um, so I had Crane lead up and running, but sort of had this idea of like, oh, maybe there could be a Norns version of this. Like, what would that look like? How
Hmm.
could that be
Hmm.
interesting? Um, and I think one of the first ideas was, oh, it could have its own sound engine, so you don't need the modular.
And this
Um,
is what Super Collider comes in, right?
Yeah, and so it circles back to SuperCollider,
It always
but
does,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, but in a very different way, obviously,
So,
and
but
yeah,
since we're talking about engines within Super Collider and the way how ASCII, as well as words and how your thought of interacting with synth engines and words. Uh, I noticed, while playing around in schicksalslied and then playing around in SuperLied, is there a different way of how the synth engine basically takes that information? Because like in SuperLied, I find it far more, let's say, quantized to a scale. It's far more musical. It's not abstract as it is in schicksalslied. So what was the thought there? Like,
I think that's like a good description of Super Lead to some degree. It is a little more like left-brained in some ways. Um, and that was a part of what I like wanted out of it. I'm trying to think. I don't know that there is really a different like a really meaningful difference in terms of how it is interpreting the text. Well, okay, here's the thing. So a part of it has to do with the way that it's processing the string being the user input plain text. Um, so in sequence, the sequence library for norns and crow, um, uh, you can't, or you couldn't, when I was developing stuff. There's a new version of sequence now that can do all sorts of different things. So maybe you can do this now. But I don't think you could just rotate the sequence. But you could pull every certain value. Like you could pull every second value, every third value, every fourth value. And so a part of what I wanted CrayonLied and later schicksalslied to do is to be able to create a number of different sequences from a single input text value. So having one synth voice that would pull every first value, every first ASCII value, right, from the string, and then a second one that would pull every second, and a third one that would pull every third, and a fourth one that would pull every fourth, etc., was a way to create a number of distinct but interrelated musical elements that were all generated from a single input text, such that I think Walker Farrell gave me this metaphor for playing modular, and I think it applies here as well to the sort of experience of playing CrayonLied or schicksalslied or SuperLied. It's less like playing a guitar, and it's more like being a conductor.
I can see the resemblance there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted that facet of it to be able to sort of control like a whole band with like one line of poetry, and then enter another line and have it change the whole band at the same time, if that makes sense.
I mean, weirdly enough, now that you're mentioning it, like in a sense, it's almost like the dreadful AI prompt, right? You just type in, and then make the synth engine decide, whether how to process. I mean, there's a code, obviously. There is a way of doing it, but just like it's always so interesting to basically, at least when I'm playing around, is putting in words or putting in very, very short elements, because short sentences, because I see that like at least for me, having a gigantic sentence, it just like creates a bit of chaos. But like having something far more dividable and everything like that, it's just so interesting to hear what's gonna come back at you, and then how to incorporate that. And I see myself having like an association when you write a word or you write a very short sentence, and then how the instrument plays back to you is almost like, in a way, like a super organism, just kind of shuffling ideas that it's from that. And in a way, it kind of gives it life, and I find that kind of interesting, just like how to in what way we can sequence, because the lines community and especially with a lot of scripts on norns, a lot to do with sequencing, maybe because it's like a easier way of going into Lewis scripting and stuff like that. But in the same way, it's almost like, hey, how can we make sound, but like in just in a new way. You know, what are those? Who are the conductors? And
Mhm.
therefore, I kind of see like with schicksalslied and with SuperLied as well, is like this: how do we make sound using very unorthodox ways of doing it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, I love that metaphor of like a conversation. And I
Hmm.
think there definitely is that. And I also I really like that about your work too, that I get that sense of the conversation with the instrument that's always happening.
Oh, fun.
Um, yeah. And I think that's definitely a part of composition with any of these scripts. Maybe especially so with the way that Crayon Lead and Schicksalslied are set up. Um, with Super Lead, I find myself making more sort of determined compositional choices going in. Um,
So what would be a strategy that you incorporate, like with like when doing certain compositions, a certain composition within these two scripts, like?
well, no, it varies really from piece to
Hmm.
piece. So I've done pieces where the process was very much like what you described, where I'm thinking about words first, and then
Hmm.
I'm entering those into the lead script, Crayon Lead or Schicksal's Lead, and I'm sort of seeing what it does with them, and then using that to go back to words and think of new and different words. And often that involves this sort of play with substitution of letters. Um, like swapping out the word dig for the word pig or
Hmm.
something like that.
Because there's a very small element of difference there, which makes a small
Yeah.
element of difference within the synth, right? Okay.
Yeah. So it can feel like a kind of natural next
Hmm.
musical, like a chord progression kind of
Hmm.
thing. Um, that was a real like word salad, but yeah, you know what I mean. Um, and other times I have composed with those scripts by, I think I've shared this on lines. I've never typed it out at all, but I hand wrote a map for myself of the values that each letter and punctuation character generates, like the MIDI note numbers
Hmm.
for. And I believe in the state they're in right now, this is a constant across all the lead scripts. They like an A will generate the same note value in Crayon lead, Schicksal's lead, or Super lead, I believe.
Hmm.
Um, I've not like gone and checked that, but I'm pretty sure that should be true. Um, uh, and I'll use that map sometimes to and think like, okay, I want to play uh, a C major seven. Here are the notes that I need to do that, and I need the lowest. I need like the C to be the lowest one because it's the root, um, and then above that I need these other notes, um, and that determines what letters I have available to me, and then it becomes kind of like uh, a word scramble game where I'm
Hmm.
making words out of the available letters and then thinking in terms of chord progressions and writing words that will play those chords.
So it's
Yeah.
basically reverse engineering the whole thing. It's like looking at the way how the combinations work within words and then trying to get a certain progression out of these words. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Because I never do. I always think about, first, which word are gonna. I mean, I know that longer words tend to create, a more defined melodic lines than, just shorter words or, rhythmic lines. But I always just go by whatever comes into my mind, never really strategize in a way. But yeah, I will try to
Well,
do this as well because it sounds fun.
well,
Um,
it can very much go both ways. And I guess for an example of that, so the piece that I just did for Blue Moon Triptych
mhm.
starts with midway. Those are the first two words, mid and then way. um, which I think initially was one word and then got split into two for musical reasons. Um, I think the M and the W didn't get along with one another, so they needed to be on separate lines. Um, but that word was sort of the beginning of it. At the time I was teaching, at the time that I was writing that piece. So to back up a little bit, that piece was uh, I was sort of solicited to contribute something to an anthology in memory of the poet Monica Berlin, who I mentioned earlier, who was a mentor to me. Her dear friend, Beth Marzoni, who was also a teacher of mine at one time, reached out to me and mentioned that she was um, soliciting all this work from different people Monica had mentored over the years to put together this anthology.
Mhm.
So I was working on a piece for that. Uh, this is like a year ago that Monica died. It's actually almost exactly a year ago. A year ago, like on November 5th, I think. Um, so I was thinking about that, how to write a piece for Monica, and at the time I was also teaching Dante's Inferno. The first line of which is famously midway through the journey of our lives.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about that line and finding oneself in a dark wood, and which is the context in which sort of what follows from that line. And the title of the piece is Woods.
Mhm.
Um, uh, in thinking about Monica's, for one thing, Monica's having passed relatively young. She was 50.
Mhm.
And for another thing, um, thinking about this sort of entry into the afterlife, which is sort of what's going on in the Inferno at that point. It's the sort of beginning of, meeting Virgil and descending.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so in thinking about a sort of send off for a departed friend, that seemed like a place to start. So it's, which I mention all of that just to say, well, I mention all of that in part so that it's something you can cut to if you want to. And
Okay.
I also mention it um, just to say that was one that very much started with language.
What do you mean started with
Started
language?
with started with it's got to be midway,
Aha, okay, yeah,
and
yeah.
now musically, where am I going to go from there?
Because I was thinking when you were describing this, you kind of took one word and then, from where did this word come from, right? So there was like a whole backstory to that. And I'm kind of interested. Okay, so like because in poetry, at times like there are different ways how to start poetry and there are different ways of how to do it. It's just like thinking where this word came from and how it came to be for you to basically type it in a script that's going to generate sound. I'm kind of curious. Do you do this like? Is there a certain way of how when you create poetry, are you in a certain, you know, way of thinking about a word or a sentence at first? Does it come naturally? And you just think, okay, I don't know what it means for now, but let's just see, let's just put it to paper or let's just put it on the computer or whatever. Is there a correlation when doing music? Because like with SuperLied and schicksalslied, it's like trying to connect these dots from one side of the artistic spectrum and then trying to connect it to the other side at the same time, you kind of come to the same result. So I'm kind of thinking, uh, does it differ when you do music and when you do words or word art, let's say, for example? Is that
Yeah,
for
yeah, I think it differs less and less as time goes on,
okay.
for sure. It used to differ a lot. It used to be music was much more sort of this thing that I felt my way into,
Mhm.
um, and was very intuitive about. And poetry was very methodical. And
In what way was it methodical? Like, how would you
Um,
put as an example?
a lot of the stuff I wrote as a younger person, like in my like throughout my 20s, had to do with things like like syllabic verse, like counting syllables or very specific metrical
Mhm.
patterns, or even counting letters and trying to sort of like convey meaning through those almost like numerological uh, modes of expression, uh, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Um, which I know people do in music as well,
Mhm.
in more sort of like conceptual stuff. Um, but that had never been the way that I went about music, but it was the way that I went about poetry. Um, Now it is not so much the way that I go about poetry. I think when I'm writing, it's about sort of encounter with a mystery. Um,
Okay, try to
and
explain here. Like, what do you mean?
so for a piece I was working on recently, the piece that I am working on right now,
Hmm.
it started with listening to an audio recording of a friend telling me a story. Um, Actually, a friend from the Lines Forum, Jonathan Snyder,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
sent me an audio recording of him telling me a story. I had asked him to send me an audio
Hmm.
recording of him telling me a story,
Okay,
and
yes.
uh, and again, that was just this sort of intuitive thing that was like, okay, I want audio of my friends telling me stories. I don't know
Mhm.
why. I don't know how it fits into the bigger piece, but I think this is right. I think this is like the thing that needs to
So
happen
this is
now.
the element of mystery. Where did this idea came from? And
Mhm.
you cannot justify it just yet, but it's something that feels intuitively a good thing to do at that moment, right?
Yeah, and then sort of allowing it to unfold and allowing these sort of connections to arise. Um, so Jonathan's story was about being in part about being in Stockholm,
Hmm.
Sweden, and I had been in Stockholm not that long ago. So now I'm thinking about when I was in Stockholm, and I start writing a story back to Jonathan about the time when I was in Stockholm, and some common threads and common themes begin to emerge between the two stories. Um, and now things are sort of happening and connections are starting to happen. Um, and
It's
things
like a
like, yeah,
synchronicity in a way. Just
yeah. And so I think there's a lot of faith in that. Like, I'm just gonna do this thing. I'm gonna ask my friend to send me a story, and I believe that that will lead somewhere where it's supposed to go.
so that
Um,
so another aspect of mystery here is that is like, do you okay, let me rephrase this question. Do you find do you find like there's a more esoteric faith-based way of doing it? And I'm not talking about the divine. I'm just talking about something that, as as creative people that we are, where do we find certain aspects that kind of feel at times that we're almost guided, like, even though that we're doing that as well. But like, I I I I I, I get the sense when talking to people online, or just lurking around and stuff like that, that there's always like this, especially in the sonic arts and more abstract artistic nests, that there's this sense of like the invisible kind of influencing or talking through us, and you don't know where that idea came from, or you might find some really weird lines of where you took those, but at the same time, you just find it a bit mysterious of how it came to be, and you're okay with that.
I mean, I agree that there does seem to be a particular like predilection for this on lines. I don't know what that is exactly. I mean, I think it's like it's a tone, right? That
Hmm.
like um that Brian and Kelly have set,
Hmm.
that um that folks like Dan continue to set. Um and I think that sort of snowballs in a way. But But yeah, what the unknown thing makes me think about, um, well, a couple things. So one is there's a wonderful essay by Bruno Latour called uh, Socrates and Callicles' Settlement, or the Invention of the Impossible Body Politic, in which Latour talks about how when we use the word science, it's an essay about science to some
Hmm.
degree. It's about Plato and it's about science.
Hmm.
Uh, he talks about how when we talk about science, we're really talking about two things. One of them is this idea of sort of popular science that is like a handing down of static truths from on high, like seeing some clickbaity article saying like science says coffee is good for you, and then next week seeing one that says science says coffee is bad for you or whatever. Um, and the other is science as scientists experience it, which is a kind of continual process of encounter with the unknown,
Hmm.
um,
Okay.
in which we can establish certain tacit understandings, uh, while also understanding that those established truths are always up for uh, revision or
Revisions. Yeah.
reevaluation, in the face of further evidence, and that this is actually what like doing science kind of is about. It's about encounter with the unknown, um, and I think considered in that way, doing art is very much the same thing in any medium. It's this encounter with the unknown in which we can kind of find our footing a little bit in the context of working on any particular piece. Um, either as a creator or as an audience member or a reader or a listener or whatever, we can sort of find our footing and establish some kind of tacit understanding with it. Like, oh, this is why this is here, and this is why that's there, and this is how I sort of put those puzzle pieces together in my mind. Um, but it also grows and evolves and changes all the time. So yeah, it's that process of encounter with the unknown. The other thing that this makes me think about is the I Ching.
The what? The I Chang?
The I Ching, the Book of
Okay.
Changes, which is
Okay.
like an ancient Chinese divination method.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, the kind of canonical English version of the I Ching is a translation of a German version of the I Ching called the Wilhelm Baines translation. And the introduction to the Wilhelm Baines translation is by Carl Jung. In Jung's introduction to the Wilhelm Baines I Ching, he writes about the purpose of I Ching divination, which involves a lot of tossing of coins. So this uh, a chance-based method. And what Jung says about this chance-based method is so basically what you're doing in doing an I Ching reading is throwing coins and writing down the results of the coin tosses. That's
Hmm.
typically like what it looks like. And then after like six coin tosses, you've wound up with a hexagram, hex for six. And
Hmm.
that corresponds to some idea that is contained within the book, which you can then read. Um, and Jung says about this that it's a way of taking an ineffable quality of a specific moment in time and pinning it down and making it intelligible to us in ways that it isn't normally. Uh,
So it's basically taking the randomness and then trying to define meaning within this randomness that you just
yeah,
did, because you're doing the coin flip. I assume that you're doing the method, well, not methodology, but you're doing the action on that, and
yeah,
then results are up for interpretation, which you find.
yeah. Well, and the coin flip is something that is occurring in this moment, right? And so the
Okay.
result of the coin flip is an expression of the moment in a sense, and
Oh
and
yeah, yeah,
perhaps
yeah.
and so it perhaps tells us something about the moment and something that we might not otherwise be able to discern with our normal sort of
So it's
perceptual
basically,
faculties.
crudely crudely said, it's kind of in the way I wouldn't say connected, but tarot reading or stuff like that, which is, again, it's something which is in the moment laid out for you, and it's vague enough to be interpreted to whatever way you're doing it. I'm not a keen believer in tarot reading, although I do like the esoteric arts and stuff like that. I just find them interesting. But one thing that I kind of found out is that, when you have gazillion of videos and articles of how to read tarot cards, at the end of the day, it's totally up to you. What kind of meaning do you personally get from that? And that in a way seems like, okay, so it's basically me talking to myself through using a medium that will help me decide to really know what I feel like.
Yeah.
So in a
Yeah,
way,
absolutely.
would you say like the music, the creating music, like kind of has the same effect? We do know, how to turn the knobs. We do know some elements of the technicalities of stuff, just enough for us to basically, okay, if you wanted this to act a certain way, we'll just move it in a certain way. But at the end of the day, it's still, there's that the unknown esoteric hair that comes out and basically vibrates the molecules. So we hear in a way that we thought that we're gonna hear, but there's still this element of unpredictability that we just decided that it makes sense at that time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah,
I
sorry
think
for being
no, that's awesome. I was not expecting us to be talking about this. This is
yeah, me
great.
neither.
um yeah, I mean um I think music is a sculpture made of time,
Mhm.
you know? So it's sculpting time and it's creating a particular moment. Um and inevitably has something of us in it,
Mhm.
and hopefully has something of us that we want to give to someone else. I think that's maybe a difference for me, is that when I'm, between like reading the I Ching and making art. If I'm reading the I Ching, it's kind of an encounter that I'm having with myself, like you were saying about
Mhm.
tarot.
Mhm.
Um, if I'm making art, it is decidedly an encounter that I want to have with, between myself and someone else.
So in
Um,
a way, because you mentioned finding sounds that are lonely, like some time ago when we talked, would you say that like in a way you feel like that's a good gateway to connection, like creating music, even though there's or some feeling of loneliness when creating it, at the same time, ironically, it has an intent to connect somebody else to you.
Yeah, and it's, I think, opening up that space of being by oneself to someone else is saying like that you're invited to the deepest, most secret parts of me. You can have all of it. It's vulnerability. And vulnerability is like, that's how we build trust. That's how we build uh community. Um, I think that's been a big shift in my perspective towards art making over the years. Has actually been putting more and more emphasis um, on vulnerability, um, and on that kind of vulnerability that's about building trust and building community, um, and like and thinking about how I can practice care in making of thing in the making of things, um, and less and less emphasis on whether or not you think I'm smart or cool, which was a lot of what art making was about when I was a younger person. Uh, I really wanted people to think I was smart and cool when they saw my work. Um, and Now I think like the best outcome from like experiencing a piece of mine to me would be that like that you think you're smart and cool. That's what I
I,
would like to have happen.
I think this is probably the most perfect finish to this conversation. It's just on this lovely note of basically opening up to yourself in order to find connection and for the other person to feel kindness. That's the great mystery of art has been solved in a way with that sentence. William, thank you so much for taking the time in order for us to talk
Yeah, thank you, Andy.
and all that. It's been really wonderful. I thought we were just gonna go through some technical or some more let's say more mundane ways of asking and questioning and asking stuff, but it just kind of evolved into this really lovely conversation that I really want to have with artists in mind, obviously. So thanks again, and we
Yeah,
can say goodbye at that.
yeah, it's been a pleasure and it's an honor. Thanks for spending the time with me.